The Uncharted Future, a collection of sci-fi visions by Rainer. This short story is called The Waters Rose Without Warning. The models had predicted years, but the ice melted faster. The glaciers that had stood for millennia collapsed into the ocean in massive chunks, raising sea levels faster than any scientist had forecasted. Coastal cities around the world were the first to go. New York, Shanghai, London. Each one swallowed as the seas pushed inland, inch by inch. In Bangladesh, entire villages disappeared overnight. In Miami, the streets became rivers, the ocean surging into living rooms and lobbies. Jakarta, already sinking, fell beneath the waves completely. The waters climbed steadily, taking homes, roads, memories. Streets became waterways, buildings became islands, and the familiar became foreign. The ocean claimed what it wanted, and it wanted everything. New York was hit hard. The seawalls meant to protect Lower Manhattan crumbled under the relentless pressure. Battery Park turned into a lagoon, the financial district's once bustling streets now silent canals. Skyscrapers stood half submerged, windows shattered by storm surges. Subway tunnels filled with brackish water, cutting off the city's lifeblood. The iconic skyline remained, but the city itself was a ghost, its people forced to retreat to the higher ground of the suburbs and beyond. Central Park became a swamp, dotted with makeshift rafts and desperate survivors fishing in ponds that were never meant to be. Shanghai's fate was no different. The city that had stood as a symbol of China's economic rise found itself drowning. The Huangpu River overflowed, and the city's intricate web of canals overflowed with seawater. Pudong's glittering towers, once symbols of progress, now stood in waist-deep water. The Bund, once a bustling waterfront, became an eerie ghost town where the wealthy had fled and only the desperate remained. Entire neighborhoods were swallowed, and millions were left to fend for themselves, struggling against water that showed no sign of retreat. Hong Kong fared no better. Victoria Harbor overflowed, and the city's famous skyline, once a beacon of Asia's prosperity, became a row of half-drowned structures. Skyscrapers were abandoned as the water rose floor by floor, their lower levels turned to murky tanks of debris and ruined electronics. The wealthy escaped to the new territories, fortified hilltop homes guarded by private security forces, leaving the poor trapped in cramped, waterlogged apartments with no way out. The star ferry routes vanished, replaced by small boats ferrying supplies between the flooded remnants of a city that had once been unstoppable. In Jakarta, the floods were not just a consequence, they were a culmination. Already sinking due to groundwater extraction, the city became a labyrinth of flooded streets and collapsing homes. Kampungs, otherwise known as villages, once filled with life, turned into floating shanty towns tied to poles and half-submerged trees. The government had long planned to move the capital to higher ground, but it was too late for Jakarta. The old city was left to the sea, a chaotic sprawl where the poor lived on boats or makeshift platforms, scraping by on whatever they could salvage. Singapore, once a model of efficiency and urban planning, struggled against the tides. The island city-state had built barriers, floodgates, and pumps to keep the water out, but the ocean was relentless. The Marina Bay Sands, once a symbol of luxury, became a fortress against the water, its lower floors sealed off, its iconic infinity pool overlooking not a city but a sea. Desalination plants worked overtime, but the city's resources were stretched thin. The wealthy stayed in penthouses far above the floodline, while migrant workers and the poor found themselves displaced, forced into cramped shelters with no guarantees of safety. London's Thames barrier was overwhelmed within days. The river spilled into the city, flooding the underground and turning Westminster into a shallow lake. Parliament stood marooned, Big Ben a lonely spire rising from the water. The financial heart of the city, the Square Mile, became uninhabitable. In East London, council estates were abandoned, their residents evacuated to camps set up in the hills of Surrey. The West End theaters were dark, their stages drowned, the sounds of applause replaced by the lapping of waves against the grand entrances. Sydney faced the rising Pacific with little more than sandbags and hope. The Opera House, a symbol of Australia's cultural pride, was surrounded by water, its steps submerged. Bondi Beach vanished under a tide, the coastline reshaped by forces beyond control. The city's ferries, once bustling with tourists, now carried refugees from flooded suburbs, bringing them inland to hastily constructed camps. The affluent moved to the Blue Mountains, leaving behind a city struggling to keep its head above water. Toronto, once thought safe, faced its own reckoning as the Great Lakes swelled. The city's waterfront disappeared, its marinas flooded, and the islands submerged. The CN Tower loomed over a city half drowned, a lone sentinel over a transformed landscape. The underground path system filled with water, cutting off the arteries that connected the city's core. People moved to the suburbs, abandoning downtown to the encroaching lake. The wealthy retreated to cottages in the north, turning them into fortified compounds, while the city's poor remained behind, struggling to survive in a place that no longer resembled home. In South America, cities like Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires fought against rising tides with little success. In Rio, the favelas on the hillsides looked down on a city flooded from the coast. The rich fled to the heights of the mountains, while those in the slums built barriers of rubble and garbage, trying to keep the sea at bay. Buenos Aires turned into a patchwork of flooded streets and broken levees, its once vibrant neighborhoods struggling under the weight of water and neglect. In Africa, Lagos was consumed by the Atlantic. The wealthy moved inland to private estates, while the poor stayed behind, building floating shanties and fishing in the contaminated waters of their former streets. Cairo's Nile Delta was no longer fertile. Saltwater intruded into the fields, killing crops and poisoning the soil. Alexandria disappeared beneath the waves, its ancient monuments hidden beneath the tide. The continent's coastal cities, already vulnerable, faced a new struggle as millions became climate refugees, pushing further inland into areas already struggling with their own droughts and famines. In India, Mumbai's iconic marine drive vanished, replaced by a sea that reached far into the city. Slums were washed away, and the wealthy took refuge in the few remaining high-rises that had not yet been compromised. Chennai faced the same fate, with water creeping into every corner of the city, forcing mass evacuations. Kolkata's streets became rivers, the Howrah Bridge standing as the last connection to a city sinking under its own weight. The rural poor moved toward the urban centers, but found no refuge, only overcrowded camps and limited aid. In Southeast Asia, Bangkok's canals, once a tourist attraction, turned deadly as the sea rose. The city's floating markets were abandoned, replaced by makeshift homes on stilts, the water inching higher with every passing day. In Ho Chi Minh City, the Mekong Delta was lost, and the city followed, its infrastructure crumbling under the push of the tide. In Manila, millions crowded into high ground, sharing space with rats and disease, waiting for aid that never arrived. The collapse of agriculture brought famine on a global scale. Crops failed as fields turned to swamps, and once fertile land became salt-crusted wasteland. Wheat rotted in the fields of the American Midwest, drowned under unrelenting rains. In Africa, maize and millet withered, unable to grow in the sodden ground. The rice paddies of Southeast Asia were overtaken by saltwater, leaving once abundant harvests ruined. Livestock drowned in their pens, and the supply chains that once fed billions broke down completely. Mass starvation swept through regions, first in the poorest areas, then spreading like a plague to places that had once been secure. With food scarce, wars erupted. Nations turned inward, prioritizing their own survival at the expense of others. Old alliances fractured as countries fought for dwindling resources. Rivers that once marked borders became battlegrounds. Skirmishes over water rights escalated into full-scale conflicts. In the Middle East, the Euphrates and Tigris became lifelines fiercely contested by desperate governments. In South Asia, the Indus River sparked violence between neighbors. Europe saw a new kind of warfare as nations built walls, not to keep people out, but to hoard the last remaining supplies. Politics descended into chaos. Governments lost control, unable to provide for their citizens. In the United States, states seceded from a fractured union, each fending for itself. In Europe, the EU disbanded as member states turned nationalist, closing borders and hoarding resources. Dictatorships rose in the vacuum, promising order and control, but delivering brutality instead. Anarchy spread in places where authority broke down completely. Gangs, militias, and rogue military units became the new law, controlling what little remained through force. In the cities, anarchy reigned. Looting became survival. Armed groups roamed the flooded streets, taking what they wanted. Governments declared martial law, but enforcement was sporadic, often non-existent. In New York, emergency shelters were overrun, and food riots broke out in the parks that had once been refuges of calm. In Paris, the Champs-Élysées turned into a battleground as the desperate clashed with security forces. In Bangkok, gangs controlled access to the few dry places left, demanding bribes for a place to sleep or a sip of water. Those who adapted lived on the edges. They fished in flooded streets, planted gardens on rooftops, and collected rainwater when they could. Solar panels and old batteries became their lifelines, keeping a few lights on when the sun was high. They formed new communities, small enclaves that survived by being invisible, disconnected from the remnants of the old world. They learned to live with less, to make do with what was left, to find order in the chaos. There were whispers of new cities being built far from the coast, places protected by natural barriers, designed to survive the next disaster. These were not open to all. They were the domains of the rich, accessible only by invitation or wealth. High walls and drones kept watch, scanning for intruders. Those on the outside knew better than to try. They were walled out, left to fend for themselves in the flooded ruins of the past. The waters kept rising, inch by inch, swallowing more land with every season. The coastlines were redrawn, and what was left of the world grew smaller. The flood was not a temporary crisis, it was a new reality, one that left no room for the weak, the poor, the unprepared. There were no maps for this world, no guide for what came next. Just the slow, unending rise of the water, erasing what once was and forcing humanity to find a way to survive. It was the end of one era and the start of something else, a future defined not by progress, but by the struggle to hold on to what little remained.